The frigid January air carried the scent of rain as Detective Frank Mercer stepped out of his car, collar turned up against the morning chill. South Norton Avenue was usually quiet this time of day, but today police vehicles lined the street, their red and blue lights throwing eerie patterns across the weathered facades of nearby buildings. Officers had cordoned off a vacant lot between two apartment buildings, their faces grim as they directed onlookers away from the scene. "What we got?" Frank asked, flashing his badge to the uniformed officer guarding the perimeter. The young cop's face was ashen, beads of sweat visible despite the winter cold. "You'd better see for yourself, detective. Never seen anything like it." Frank ducked under the yellow police tape and walked toward the cluster of officers and crime scene technicians. The vacant lot was overgrown with weeds, patches of frost still visible in the shadows. At the center of the gathering was what initially appeared to be a mannequin, posed with unnatural precision. Then Frank saw the blood. Not much of it, just dark stains on the pale skin, but enough to confirm this was no store display. Captain Reynolds approached, his normally composed demeanor shaken. "Victim's name is Grace Halter, 22 years old. Aspiring actress. Landlady identified her from a photograph." Frank knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene. Grace had been positioned on her back, hands arranged at her sides, palms down. Her legs were slightly spread, as if to display the gruesome fact that her body had been severed at the waist, the two halves placed together with chilling precision. But it was her face that haunted him most. Her mouth had been sliced from ear to ear in a grotesque parody of a smile. "Jesus," Frank whispered. "Who would do something like this?" "The press is already calling her the Lavender Dahlia," Reynolds said, gesturing to a purple fabric fragment found nearby. "Apparently she was known for wearing violet clothing. Always talked about making it big in Hollywood." Frank stood, removing his hat as he surveyed the scene one more time. No blood pool. She was killed somewhere else and dumped here. "That's not all," said Dr. Eleanor Powell, the medical examiner, approaching with a clipboard. "Preliminary observation suggests the body's been completely drained of blood. And look at the cuts, they're precise, like they were done with surgical instruments. Whoever did this had medical knowledge." Frank turned away from the body, scanning the perimeter of the lot where officers were canvassing for evidence. "Any witnesses?" "None so far," Reynolds replied. "Body was discovered by a woman walking her dog at 6:15 this morning." A flash went off nearby as a crime scene photographer documented the body from various angles. Frank knew that by afternoon, newspapers across the country would be plastered with sensational headlines about the Lavender Dahlia. Los Angeles in 1947 was a city obsessed with Hollywood glamour and dreams of stardom, but beneath the glitz lurked something darker, something that had transformed a young woman's ambitions into a grotesque tableau of death. "I want everything," Frank said. "Background, friends, enemies, boyfriend, work history. And keep the press at bay as long as possible." As if summoned by his words, Frank spotted a familiar figure at the edge of the police line, Vivian Carter, a tenacious crime reporter for the Los Angeles Times, already scribbling in her notebook. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a slight nod. Frank had worked with her before. She was sharp and ambitious, but played fair, unlike many of her colleagues. Later that afternoon, Frank sat at his desk in the precinct, surrounded by preliminary reports. Grace Halter had arrived in Los Angeles 18 months ago from a small town in Nebraska. She'd taken acting classes, worked as a waitress at the Blue Jasmine Diner, and had bit parts in 2 minor productions. Neighbors described her as friendly but focused on her career. No serious boyfriends, though she'd been seen with various men at industry events. "Detective Mercer." A young officer approached his desk. "There's someone here to see you about the Halter case. Says she was friends with the victim." The woman who entered was in her early 20s, blonde hair styled in fashionable waves, hands clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "I'm Patricia Wells," she said, voice trembling. "Grace was my roommate until 3 months ago." "Please, have a seat, Miss Wells," Frank gestured to the chair beside his desk. Any information you can provide would be helpful. Patricia sank into the chair, eyes red-rimmed. I saw the papers. Is it true how they found her? Frank nodded grimly. I'm afraid so. When did you last see Grace? 2 weeks ago, at the Blue Jasmine. She seemed different. Excited about something, but secretive. Patricia's voice dropped to a whisper. She said she'd met someone who was going to change everything for her. Someone important. Did she mention a name? Patricia shook her head. But there was something else. Last month, she called me late at night, sounding scared. Said she'd seen something she shouldn't have at some party in the hills. Something about doctors doing experiments. Frank leaned forward. Experiments? What kind of experiments? She wouldn't say. Just that it involved important people. The next day she acted like nothing happened, said she'd had too much to drink. Patricia hesitated. There's one more thing. The day before they found her, she called me. Said she needed to meet urgently. She never showed up. As Patricia left the station, Frank stared at his notes, the words doctors and experiments underlined twice. The surgical precision of the cuts on Grace's body flashed in his mind. The phone on his desk rang. Mercer, he answered. Detective, this is Dr. Powell. You need to see this. I found something during the autopsy. The morgue was cold and sterile, the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off metal surfaces. Dr. Powell, still in her blood-stained apron, led Frank to where Grace's body lay on the examination table, now covered with a sheet. The severing of the body was done post-mortem, she explained, but that's not what killed her. There was a puncture wound at the base of her skull, expertly placed to sever the brain stem. Instant death. And there's something else. She pulled back the sheet, revealing Grace's right wrist. Just visible on the pale skin was a small tattoo, a lavender flower. It's fresh, maybe a week old. And this, she pointed to a nearly invisible mark on the inside of the left arm, needle marks. Multiple injections, recent. Frank frowned. Drugs? No common narcotic I can identify. I've sent samples to the lab, but... She hesitated. Frank, these injuries, the precision of the cuts. This isn't just murder. It's almost like a medical procedure. As Frank exited the hospital into the night air, a black sedan pulled alongside him. The window rolled down to reveal Vivian Carter, the reporter. Get in, detective, she said. There's something you should hear. Against his better judgment, Frank slid into the passenger seat. This better be good, Carter. 3 months ago, I was working on a story about experimental treatments at Westridge Psychiatric Hospital, Vivian said, keeping her voice low. Voluntary patients subjected to unethical procedures. My editor killed the story, pressure from above. But I kept digging. She handed him a folder. 2 patients died under suspicious circumstances. Both young women, both aspiring actresses. Frank opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Who was in charge of these treatments? Dr. Walter Kennedy, Vivian replied. Brilliant surgeon, decorated war veteran, connected to half the power players in the city. She paused. And I have a source who claims Grace Halter attended a private party at Kennedy's Bel Air estate the weekend before she died. The name triggered Frank's memory. Kennedy, wasn't he questioned in that scandal last year? The one involving missing medical supplies? Charges were dropped. Influential friends. Vivian's eyes met his. Be careful, Frank. Kennedy has connections to some dangerous people. Word is, he performed special services for mob bosses during Prohibition, the kind of surgery that doesn't happen in hospitals. By morning, Frank had pulled every file he could find on Dr. Walter Kennedy. Distinguished career, innovative surgical techniques developed during the war, respected in medical circles, and, as Vivian had mentioned, well connected to both Hollywood elites and city officials. Nothing concrete to tie him to any wrongdoing, yet something didn't sit right. Frank's partner, Detective Ray Sullivan, dropped a file on his desk. Canvassed the area around the lot where Grace was found. Got a witness, homeless veteran who sleeps in the alley a block away. Says he saw a black car, expensive, parked there around 4 a.m. on the morning she was found. Man in a dark coat got out, opened the trunk. Description: tall, well-dressed. Couldn't see his face. Ray shrugged. Not much to go on. What about the needle marks Dr. Powell found? Lab results came back inconclusive. Something experimental, they said. Frank stared at Dr. Kennedy's photograph in the file, the distinguished-looking man with silver hair at his temples and a confident smile. I think it's time we paid the good doctor a visit. Westridge Psychiatric Hospital stood on a hill overlooking the city, its Victorian architecture at odds with the modern medical equipment inside. Dr. Kennedy's office was spacious, walls lined with medical texts and framed credentials. The man himself exuded confidence and authority, shaking Frank's hand with a firm grip. Detective Mercer, how can I help the police department today? His voice was smooth, cultured. We're investigating the murder of Grace Halter, Frank said, watching carefully for any reaction. Name mean anything to you, Doctor? Kennedy's expression remained neutral. I'm afraid not. Though I've seen the unfortunate headlines. Terrible business. We understand she attended a party at your home recently. A flicker, almost imperceptible, crossed Kennedy's face. I host many gatherings for hospital benefactors and friends. Young aspiring actresses often attend, hoping to make connections. I couldn't possibly remember every guest. Mind if we have a list of attendees from your recent events? Kennedy smiled politely. I'd be happy to provide that, Detective, though I'm sure you understand these events are often informal. Not everyone signs a guest book. As they spoke, Frank noticed a photograph on the wall, Kennedy with a group of men in military uniforms. Army Medical Corps. Yes, Kennedy nodded. Served in Europe. Battlefield surgery teaches you techniques you'd never learn in civilian practice. The ability to improvise, to work with limited resources. The interview yielded little concrete information, but as they left the hospital, Frank couldn't shake a sense of unease. He's hiding something, he told Ray. Did you notice how he tensed when I mentioned the party? Not enough for a warrant, Ray cautioned. Man's got friends in high places. We go after him without solid evidence, we'll both be directing traffic in San Pedro by next week. That evening, Frank received an unexpected visitor at his modest apartment. Patricia Wells stood at his door, even more distressed than during their first meeting. I remembered something, she said, once inside. Grace kept a diary. After she moved out, I found it under a floorboard in our apartment. I wasn't going to read it, but after what happened. She handed him a small leather-bound book. There are entries about Dr. Kennedy in there. She met him at an audition for a hospital fundraiser commercial. He took a special interest in her acting career. Frank flipped through the diary, stopping at an entry from 2 months prior. Dr. K says I'm special, that my blood type is rare and valuable for his research. Offered me $500 just for samples. With that money, I could finally get better headshots, maybe even afford that acting coach everyone recommends. Later entries grew increasingly concerning. The injections make me dizzy, but Dr. K says that's normal. The money is good, and he's introduced me to some important producers. One even mentioned a supporting role. And the final entry, dated just 3 days before her death. Something's wrong. The last procedure wasn't like the others. There were other doctors there, watching. I overheard them talking about perfect preservation and advancing the field. When I asked Dr. K about it, he just smiled and said I shouldn't worry my pretty head about medical matters. I'm scared. Called Patricia today, need to talk to someone. If anything happens to me. The entry ended there. Frank stared at the page, a chill running through him. This is evidence, Miss Wells. I'll need to keep this. After she left, Frank called Ray, reading him excerpts from the diary. We need to move on Kennedy, now. Based on a diary. DA will laugh us out of his office. We need more. Then we get more, Frank said firmly. Kennedy's having another party this weekend. High society types, Hollywood people. How do you know that? Vivian Carter. She can get us in, she's covering it for the society pages. The plan was simple but risky. Frank would attend as Vivian's photographer, Ray as catering staff. They'd look for anything connecting Kennedy to Grace, and to the experimental procedures mentioned in her diary. Kennedy's Bel Air mansion was everything Frank expected, opulent, with expansive gardens and a view overlooking the twinkling lights of Los Angeles. Guests in formal wear mingled, glasses of champagne in hand, while a jazz quartet played in the corner. Frank, uncomfortable in his borrowed tuxedo, pretended to photograph the socialites while scanning the room for Kennedy. The doctor was holding court near the fireplace, surrounded by admiring guests. Among them, Frank noticed a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Grace Halter, blonde hair, delicate features, wearing a distinctive lavender dress. That's Elaine Morrison, Vivian whispered, following his gaze. Another aspiring actress. Word is Kennedy's taken her under his wing recently. Keep an eye on her, Frank murmured. I'm going to look around. Using the excuse of finding better lighting for photographs, Frank slipped away from the main party, moving deeper into the house. Most doors were locked, but a service stairway led to the basement level. There, a long corridor stretched before him, clinically lit and sterile, jarringly out of place in the otherwise warmly decorated home. At the end of the hall, a heavy door stood slightly ajar. Frank approached cautiously, hearing voices from within. He recognized Kennedy's cultured tones. The preservation technique is nearly perfected, Kennedy was saying. Subject 7's tissue samples maintained viability for over 72 hours. Impressive, replied another male voice. And you're certain the blood type is the key factor? Without question. The rarest types respond best to the treatment. The girl from tonight, Elaine, she's type AB negative. Perfect for our next phase. Frank leaned closer, straining to hear more, when a floorboard creaked beneath his foot. The voices inside fell silent. Frank turned to retreat, only to find his path blocked by a large man in a security uniform. This area is off-limits to guests, sir. Before Frank could respond, he felt a sharp sting in his neck, a needle, expertly placed. The world tilted sideways as his legs gave way. When Frank regained consciousness, he was lying on a cold metal table, wrists and ankles restrained. The room was dimly lit, medical equipment surrounding him. Dr. Kennedy stood over him, still in his tuxedo, but now wearing surgical gloves. Detective Mercer, Kennedy said calmly. You should have identified yourself properly. I would have given you a much more comprehensive tour. Frank struggled against the restraints. You killed Grace Halter. Killed? Kennedy looked genuinely offended. No, detective. Grace was a volunteer, a participant in medical research that will change the future of humanity. Her death was unfortunate, an unexpected reaction to one of our compounds, but her contribution to science has been invaluable. By cutting her in half. A necessary procedure to study the preservation effects in different body systems. Kennedy prepared a syringe, tapping it to remove air bubbles. Your blood type is interesting as well, detective. Not as rare as Grace's, but still useful for comparison studies. Frank's mind raced. Ray was still upstairs, undercover. If he could stall long enough. The body was displayed, posed. That wasn't science. Something dark flickered in Kennedy's eyes. Perhaps I have my artistic impulses. The human body is a canvas, detective. And in death, Grace became immortal, her image captured forever in the public imagination as the Lavender Dahlia. You won't get away with this, Frank said. People know I'm here. The diary. Yes, Patricia mentioned you had the diary when she called me. Kennedy smiled at Frank's surprise. She's been most helpful, directing suitable candidates to our research. Pretty girls with big dreams and rare blood types. A commotion sounded from somewhere above, shouts, running feet. Kennedy frowned, moving toward the door. In that moment of distraction, Frank managed to work one hand free from its loosened restraint, grabbing a scalpel from a nearby tray. Kennedy turned back, raising the syringe, but Frank was faster. The scalpel sliced across Kennedy's arm, causing him to drop the needle with a curse. Frank freed his other hand, then his feet, rolling off the table as Kennedy lunged for him. They grappled briefly before Frank gained the upper hand, slamming Kennedy against the wall. It's over, Doctor. LAPD is probably already upstairs. Kennedy's composure cracked, revealing something manic beneath. You understand nothing. My work will revolutionize medicine, tissue preservation, organ transplantation, extended life. A few sacrifices are mathematically insignificant compared to the millions who will benefit. The door burst open, and Ray rushed in, gun drawn, followed by uniformed officers. Frank. You okay? As the police led Kennedy away, Frank discovered a hidden room adjacent to the makeshift operating theater. Inside were refrigerated storage units containing labeled tissue samples, detailed records of experiments, and photographs, dozens of young women, all bearing a striking resemblance to Grace Halter. Some faces Frank recognized from missing persons reports. The case against Dr. Walter Kennedy seemed ironclad: Grace's diary, the underground laboratory, medical records documenting his experimental procedures. Yet at the arraignment, Kennedy appeared confident, almost amused by the proceedings. 3 days later, Frank was called into Captain Reynolds' office. The captain looked exhausted, defeated. DA's dropping the charges against Kennedy. Evidence has been deemed compromised, chain of custody issues. That's impossible, Frank protested. I documented everything by the book. Kennedy's lawyers are claiming illegal search and seizure. And the diary? Reynolds shook his head. Patricia Wells now says she made it all up, that Grace never kept a diary. Kennedy's walking, Frank. Orders from the top. Frank slammed his fist on the desk. He killed Grace and who knows how many others. And he has friends in the military, in Washington. His research apparently has national security implications. Case closed. But Frank couldn't let it go. He continued investigating off the books, tracing connections between Kennedy and missing young women across the country. Vivian Carter published what she could, careful accusations veiled as questions, but without hard evidence that would stand in court. Kennedy disappeared from public view, his Bel Air mansion sold, his practice closed. Rumors placed him at a private research facility in Nevada, or consulting for the government on classified projects. The case of the Lavender Dahlia faded from headlines, becoming one more dark legend in a city built on illusions. But for Detective Frank Mercer, it remained an open wound, a reminder that in Los Angeles, power and connections could literally get away with murder. Years later, long after Frank had retired from the force, a package arrived at his door. Inside was a lavender flower and a newspaper clipping about a revolutionary new technique in organ preservation, credited to research by the reclusive Dr. Walter Kennedy. Paperclipped to the article was a note in elegant handwriting: "Some secrets stay buried, detective. Some art is never fully appreciated." Frank stared at the flower, the same shade of purple that Grace Halter had favored, and wondered how many more had died for Kennedy's art and science in the years since the Lavender Dahlia case had been buried by those in power. He placed the flower in a book, alongside his notes from the case, evidence for a justice that never came, testimony to a truth the world wasn't ready to face, that monsters walked among them not in shadow, but in the bright lights of operating rooms and society galas, protected by the very institutions meant to stop them.